Let's see. You'd make a good host.
Stop abuse.
Good. Give it to somebody else.
Felicia, I would like Mr. President to put the street kids where they belong.
Where do they belong?
In their homes.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Nelson Mandela is the president of the world, not of South Africa only.
Oh.
I became friendly with a young lady of about 11 years. And one day we were chatting, and she said to me, "Do you know what the children at my school say about you?" I say, "No." She says, "They say when you were young, you were handsome, but that you are now old and ugly." So that's what some children think of me. They think I'm old and ugly.
Mr. President, I think you're like red wine. You mature beautifully. Let's see.
Ordinary South Africans are determined that the past be known, the better to ensure that it is not repeated. They seek this not out of vengeance, but so that we can move into the future together. The choice of our nation is not whether the past should be revealed, but rather to ensure that it comes to be known in a way which promotes reconciliation and peace.
Received a Nobel Peace Prize, you reported to your audience, reminded them, for nonviolent struggle. Just like Mandela just received it with F.W. de Klerk. How could you stand with your oppressor and your enemy and receive the Nobel Prize for nonviolent struggle? You do not support then Nelson Mandela's strategy in the struggle to free black people in South Africa?
Let us first of all be very clear here, Theo. Nelson Mandela is my brother.
So is
he
Jesse
is a member of the family, and so is Jesse, and Jesse is a very brilliant man. We just want him to return home and stop being used by the enemy and the oppressor against his people. Now back to Brother Nelson Mandela. And certainly we can never mention Nelson without mentioning Winnie Mandela. But Nelson Mandela's attempt at a multiracial government in South Africa after the murder of men, women, children, and babies, and the rape of South Africa, a criminal settler colony that has been established like Israel there in that part of the world. I cannot go along with one man, one vote. Let me say why. If someone broke into your home, Mr. Donahue, and actually bomb rushed your home, and Black Boots stomped your door down, and came in and robbed and raped everyone in the household, and was able to take the wealth of your home and parlay it into an empire. This is an invader. This is an intruder. This is a murderer. This is a burglar. This is a criminal. So you have no responsibility to share your home with them after they broke in and committed the crimes that they did.
When I first found out about Nelson Mandela International Day, which is the day that commemorates the birth date of Nelson Mandela, I actually was very excited to do the 67 minutes of giving in remembrance of the time Nelson Mandela spent fighting for his people. However, it has been so long since I last celebrated it that I actually just remembered that it was about his birthday, and I had done an entire recording where I basically said it was the day he died. Anyway, that aside, I'd like this to be a bit of a nuanced discussion. I'm not sure how long it's going to go or short it's going to be, purely because I hadn't necessarily planned anything out. It's just kind of me riffing from the top of my head and just putting out some stuff that I've wanted to put out for a while, because I've wanted to have this discussion on Nelson Mandela. What I've actually been trying to do for a couple of years is try and get a panel or just people who would have a discussion about the legacy of Nelson Mandela and have it be a round table, because my biggest issue is the fact that there's either the beatification or the sellout mentality. And the problem with all of that is that it places Nelson Mandela in a place that I particularly don't like, which is as the product of whiteness. And the most fascinating thing about that is the fact that it's understandable why that is, because at the end of the day, the whole reason that Nelson Mandela became a struggle icon was because of his fight against white oppression. At the same time, what has happened is he has been whitewashed to such a point that at this point I actually don't believe Nelson Mandela or the mythology of Nelson Mandela belongs to the people that he fought for. And I think that's a shame, because it ends up putting us in the same position as Americans, as African Americans have found with Martin Luther King. In this realm where the only thing that people know about him is the fact that he forgave white people, and that is the fault of Mandela himself, along with the ANC. But I think as black people we need a more nuanced discussion, and the reason this will be all over the place is because there'll definitely be more of this where I do more deep dives, and I actually prepared something with regards to the Nelson Mandela mythology and what has happened around it, because it was one of the greatest parts of the reconciliation that has led to pacification. And I know that a lot of people may have thought from the pacification essays and from the Sobukwe essay that I probably didn't like Mandela. My feelings about him are a lot more complex and a lot more nuanced, as dictated by this tweet, where I had to balance someone and kind of remind people that at the end of the day, Nelson Mandela did fight. We can talk revolutionary talk, but he fought. He was in this game. He lived this life. He was about that life, and that has to stand for something. I remember reading an opinion piece in The Guardian regarding the beatification of Nelson Mandela and how he was deemed almost a saint by exactly the kind of people who stood behind his jailers under apartheid. So the reason that I mentioned this article about him being sanitized by hypocrites and apologists is because it happened, the article came out, the opinion piece came out after Mandela had died, and it basically spoke of how the world had had a week of unrelenting beatification of Nelson Mandela by exactly the kind of people who stood behind his jailers under apartheid. It says Mandela was without question a towering historical figure and an outstanding hero of South Africa's liberation struggle. All true. So it would be tempting to imagine that all these people who stood behind his jailers under apartheid had been won over by the scale of his achievements, courage, and endurance. For some, that may be true. I won't lie, I don't believe it was true for any of them. For many others in the Western world in particular, it reeks of the rankest hypocrisy. It is, after all, Mandela's global moral authority and the manifest depravity of the system he and the African National Congress brought to an end that now makes the hostility of an earlier time impossible to defend. So history has had to be comprehensively rewritten. Mandela and the ANC appropriated and sanitized, and inconvenient facts minimized or ignored. The whitewashed narrative has such been a success that the former ANC leader has been reinvented and embraced as an all-purpose kumbaya figure by politicians across the spectrum. This is what he talks about. He talks about how all these world leaders were in this fantasy where the racist apartheid tyranny was just an aberration, which is something I have spoken about repeatedly, about the fact that people act as though apartheid was just this thing that happened. In real life, it wasn't just Margaret Thatcher who branded Mandela a terrorist, the article continues, and resisted sanctions, or David Cameron, who went on pro-apartheid lobby junkets. Almost the entire Western establishment effectively backed the South African apartheid regime until the bitter end. Ronald Reagan described it as essential to the free world. Our oppression was seen by the American president, one of the most loved American presidents, may I reiterate. It was seen and described as essential to the free world. Think about how America frames itself with regards to the free world. The article goes on to say the CIA gave South African security the tip-off that led to Mandela's arrest and imprisonment for 27 years. Harold Wilson's government was still selling arms to the racist regime in the 1960s, and Mandela wasn't removed from the US terrorism watch list until 2008. Yet we cannot help but think of the number of times we as Africans in South Africa are repeatedly beaten over the head with this narrative that Mandela forgave.
You said to Ted Koppel last night, a man who changes his principles depending on with whom he is dealing is not a man who can lead a nation. The context was this: what principle are you being asked to change, you, Mr. Mandela, when Americans question your praise for the human rights under Gaddafi and Castro? What is the principle involved there that you're being asked to change?
Mr. McNeil, this is a matter which should not be handled lightly, as many people do. The first country which we approached in the 60s for assistance, when our leaders had to leave the country in order to mobilize the support of the international community, the first country we approached was the United States of America. We could not even succeed to come close to the government, and they refused to assist us. But Cuba, the moment we appealed for assistance, they were ready to do so, and they did so. Why would we now listen to the Western world when they say we should have nothing to do with Cuba? It's just unreasonable. No human being acts in that particular fashion. Here is a country that was the first to assist us when the West, which had formidable resources, was actually supporting the government. Now you expect us to change our whole approach and to start condemning Cuba for what is supposed to be happening inside the country. No man of principles could ever do that. And that is what I try to convey to Koppel.
Mr. Mandela, our time is up.
And we are told this by people from the countries that were helping to oppress South Africans, black South Africans, to the extent where a Mandela was needed. Think of what happened with Mangaliso Robert Sobukwe and the Sobukwe Clause. Think of how the apartheid regime killed him between the 60s and finally succeeded in the 70s. Think of the fact that in all this time, the West was supporting this system that was basically seeking to enslave us. And our people were fighting with rocks and stones and olden day guns. These are the people who tell us that Mandela forgave. They tell us we must be like Mandela. Airbrushed out of the Mandela media story has been the man who launched a 3-decade-long armed struggle after non-violent avenues had been closed, who declared in his 1964 speech from the dock that the only social system he was tied to was socialism, who was reported by the ANC-allied South African Communist Party this week to have been a member of its Central Committee at the time of his arrest, and whose main international supporters for 30 years were the Soviet Union, aka Russia, and Cuba. Mandela also supported the ANC's armed campaign of sabotage, bombings, and attacks on police and military targets throughout his time in prison. Veterans of MK, the ANC's armed wing, emphasized that the military campaign was always subordinate to the political struggle and that civilians were never targeted, though there were civilian casualties. It's very interesting that this is written by a white male, precisely because one of the issues that we have in placing Mandela in the South African story, especially after his death, has been the story of whether or not he was a sellout. Now, I fully believe that he was a sellout. I do believe that at the end of the day, he did give up power because he went from socialist to supporter of capitalism. He came out of jail a socialist, and a few months later, when he was speaking at the World Economic Forum, he announced that the ANC would not be seeking to nationalize the mines, which meant that the efforts to return land to the people, to the hands of the people, had basically been stonewalled by the ANC. In the year 2000, Dr. Noel Solani wrote an article in an attempt to re-examine the euphoria around Mandela that had been created and continued to be maintained by the press, as well as the Robben Island Museum. In it, he speaks of the concept of myth, which carries various meanings. According to Aho, mythology legitimizes a certain ideal or practice, and this in turn confirms, as it were, the validity of the mythology. I. Thompson defined political myths as tales about the past to legitimize or discredit a regime. Myth express and codify beliefs. It safeguards and enforces morality and suggests that myths are universal. Two myths are about the ways in which meaning is mobilized in a particular context. And because myths cannot simply be described as lies or truths, but seen as stories with particular significance in particular contexts, he looked at the representations of Mandela as a saint and how that myth has been created, arguing that the creation of Mandela as a struggle hero was presented as a fulfillment of a historical mission. This is in line with those who believe that historical narratives fulfill psychological and social needs rather than scientific demands. It was true of the liberation struggle. Heroes were created and many myths told, but they were told within the paradigm of relative truthfulness. So we can go back and thinking about this to speaking about Mandela Robert Sobukwe, who, if you really look at his story, is the real Nelson Mandela in a way. And that's not to say that what Mandela has done and what he has been to this country means nothing. But if we think of the concept of Mandela selling out, we need to understand what selling out means. Just for a quick dictionary definition, selling out is described as a betrayal of one's principles for reason of expedience. So if we then look at the story of Nelson Mandela to figure out if he did sell out, we need to look at whether or not his principles were betrayed. And obviously, a quick principle that was betrayed that we can actually speak to is the fact that he walked into prison as a socialist and left prison as a capitalist. Secondly, we can look at the fact that we hear more about Mandela from the likes of, oh, I hate that woman, Zelda Lagrange. I can't stand that woman. But we hear more about him through her lens than we do from the people who were in the struggle with him. There are people who actually do not link Jacob Zuma, even Cyril Ramaphosa, tenuous as that link is. But there are people who don't link the likes of Jacob Zuma and Thabo Mbeki to Nelson Mandela. They are quicker to link that God who apparently took care of him in prison, which I don't understand how that power dynamic could have not been applicable. But people are happier with seeing him in his role as the person who hired Zelda and divorced Winnie. Winnie doesn't even really enter the lexicon of the mainstream Mandela narrative in 2023. I mean, we had to basically fight for Winnie Mandela's humanity when she died. We were basically online trying to make this narrative understood that Winnie was actually the reason Nelson Mandela existed. And when I say she was the reason Nelson Mandela existed, I am very well aware of the fact that Nelson Mandela was very much entrenched in the struggle by the time that he met and married Winnie. What I am saying is the fact that Winnie Mandela kept Nelson Mandela's name alive when he was in prison, and his name was falling into obscurity, and Winnie Mandela and the people in the street were actually keeping him alive in the memory of the people. Solani further writes, after the unbanning of the liberation movements, the political environment in South Africa changed. In the process of creating heroes of their cause, and an attempt to bolster their own philosophies as the most correct ones, various types of historical truths emerged. Truths that are hard to support with any documentation except the group of narrators themselves. In 1956, 156 people were charged for treason in South Africa. They came from all corners of the Republic. Prominent amongst them was Chief Albert Luthuli, and they included members of the National Executive Committee of the ANC such as Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, Robert Resha, and Nelson Mandela himself. The trial lasted for 4 years and ended up in all the accused being acquitted. Immediately after that acquittal, Nelson Mandela went underground and left the country to solicit support for the armed struggle. He left without a valid passport. Shortly after his return, he was captured and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment for leaving the country without valid documentation. Whilst underground, Mandela became the most wanted man by the state. It was during this period that he also became most famous with the media. The South African media then dubbed him the Black Pimpernel. After his 5-year sentence in 1963, the first Release Mandela Committee was launched to agitate for his release. So what we see here is the hiding of Mandela as an actual threat to the state. And what a lot of people say is that when political prisoners commit acts against the state in their attempts to get freedom for their people, people say that they are innocent. That's not true. And the reason that that is important is because at the end of the day, we need to understand revolution for what it is. And in being able to hide Nelson Mandela, the revolutionary, the man who was willing to go to town on the apartheid government, it allows people to then believe that what happened under apartheid was that there was the Rivonia trial. Nelson Mandela went to prison. He made friends with all these white people, and then he got released, and then we got reconciliation. So it eliminates the entire armed struggle, and it takes away this idea that these people were violent. And in doing that, it puts into the mind of South Africans the fact that at the end of the day, this freedom wasn't won because they talked to people. It was won because they were willing to make this country ungovernable. From prison, Nelson Mandela himself tells the story to an American interviewer.
Although I'm very reluctant to talk about that because I was directly involved, and we had a clash with the warders who came to fetch us from Cape Town and across the sea to Robben Island. They wanted us to rush, and they lined us up. There were 4 of us. I was at the back with another comrade, and there were 2 others in front. And they were very harsh. And then I whispered to my colleagues that, look, we must fight right from the beginning. They must know what type of men we are right from the beginning. And we must not give the impression that they can issue instructions which conflict with our principles. If they are carrying out the regulations, we will obey that. But where they overstep the limit, we must fight and resist.
But at the same time, we also need to remember that in his being able to make such speeches and make such allowances, he always had the support of what was then a political movement, because remember, they were banned at that stage. So the ANC structures, although we can criticize a lot of it at this point because of what the ANC has become, we also must never forget that they built movements. They actually built a movement that was able to take on the apartheid government. And the problem then becomes the fact that when we are unable to contextualize Mandela specifically, we are then unable to contextualize the ANC, because what happens a lot of the time is the people who want to control the narrative, which in this case is the oppressors, want to be able to have a good guy and a bad guy. When you look at the bad guy as the apartheid government, you don't get a name. And that's so important, because a lot of us are confused regarding who the enemy was under apartheid. We are very able to point to the good guys as being the ANC. And although that's not problematic at all, it also eliminates the countless other people who were involved in liberation in this country. And it takes out the fact that it wasn't only the ANC. That's why I had a problem with the mention of how the ANC liberated South Africa. The ANC did a lot of work, a lot of good work, don't get me wrong. But they weren't the only ones who were involved in this struggle. But it teaches us about the power of networks. It also teaches us about the power of a movement and its ability to put its principles and its end goals before it actually puts personal beefs and personal egos into consideration. Because it would have been very easy for many people who were freedom fighters around the time of that Mandela was in prison to kind of go, actually, Niasbet did. We're out here fighting, and this is the guy that you all choose as a symbol. But what happened was they were all principled in their adherence to the end goal. They believed in violence, they engaged in the violence that was necessary. And by violence, I mean conflict, I mean armed conflict outside. As it said, they were involved in bombings. Mandela said himself that he knew a lot of stuff that was happening when he was inside prison a lot of the time, because what happens when people are together, especially when they have political prisoners within their midst, people are very quick to form those relations with the political prisoners, because they know what the political prisoners are fighting for. At the same time, when we eliminate the actual struggle that Nelson Mandela went through during apartheid and that led to his imprisonment, we also eliminate the personal cost to himself despite the freedom. Let's take out the freedom. Let's take out my absolute love for Mamwini. And remember that Nelson Mandela was actually married prior to that. His first wife was Evelyn. And as a case study, Dr. Sulani writes that as a liberation hero, he's a good case study of the problems experienced by leaders and their families at that macro level. The fact that these guys go out and they fight for us, it's not just at great cost to the fact that Nelson Mandela actually didn't have a profession. He was an admitted lawyer. He had worked as a lawyer, but his experience was as a struggle icon. That is what he was doing. That was the work he was doing for a long time. And let's not forget that he was also in jail for whether it's 18 years or 27 years. I've never been to jail. I cannot imagine being in jail for one day. I don't know what I would do if I was in jail for one day. And that's why I'm always putting Nelson Mandela, the struggle icon, separate to Nelson Mandela or Tata as the president and the post-democratic Nelson Mandela, because I think he was more of a figurehead. I think he was kind of the grandpa we'd all like to have, and he was sent in to usher this new beautiful South Africa that we were all going to be a part of, which we now know was a smokescreen.
Apart from opposing sanctions, and I'll come back to that in a moment, opposing the relaxation of sanctions, I'll come back to that in a moment, you're also using this trip to raise the prestige and the financial resources of the African National Congress. How much do you need that? I mean, do you not have the resources and the prestige enough to carry on your struggle without this kind of international campaign?
How can we carry on the programs that we have without financial assistance from the international community? The resources of the country are monopolized by the white minority. We don't have resources. How would we be expected to rehabilitate the political exiles which are coming back, who want jobs, who want accommodation, who want educational facilities for their children? How do we rebuild the ANC, which has been banned for 30 years? How do we mobilize the entire country for peace if we don't have the resources? We cannot generate those resources from inside the country, and it's but natural for us to approach the international community for assistance in this regard.
So what's the actual point here? Because there is actually a point that I am trying to get to with this whole thing. First of all, Nelson Mandela can't solely be labeled a sellout and then we all go home. Nelson Mandela, in the same way, we can't allow him to become a European property and symbol. We need to contextualize our Nelson Mandela. And in that framing, we need to include the good and the bad. And that's because that can serve for us going forward in whatever frameworks we choose to participate in our struggle within South Africa, in our neoliberal struggle, in our struggle against neoliberalism, But it needs to be an African project. It needs to be something that we are able to be custodians of, because we need to be able to elevate our heroes and we need to be able to sanction those who become our enemies and the enemies of our people's struggle. Secondly, as Dr. Khalid Mohammed says in the beginning of this video, we need our struggle icon to come back home. And because his day is done and he's done what he needed to do and what he felt he needed to do, that would be up to us as the current and upcoming and future generations to be able to do that work. Secondly, hating Mandela the sellout stops us from engaging in an analysis of what our freedom fighters have been through. Our freedom fighters who were coming home to rebuild were facing a lot of struggles, and it's stuff that many of us would never understand because we weren't there. But through our being able to contextualize what was happening with the international community, to be able to understand what these guys were facing, whether they were right or wrong, it's something that we desperately need to be able to understand, because one thing that has never changed is how the enemy comes at us. In the same way, Toni Morrison says the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdom, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. In that same way, I think the Mandela fallacy and that myth allows us to be engaged in distraction, because if we are busy trying to quantify and qualify why we dislike Mandela, we actually then also come upon ignoring what these guys did, and we then don't necessarily appreciate it to the extent that we should. And I'm not saying that we should engage in an exercise where we then become the people who are deifying him and turning him into Jesus Christ and a Christ figure. What I'm saying is, if we have custody of our icons, we are then able to understand when we are being distracted, when we are having sports and his face and money used as something to distract us and make us think that we have reached progress and we are liberated and have reached the promised land. So I actually think I'll just leave it there for now, even though there is so much more that I thought I was going to get through that I actually haven't even gotten through, and I haven't even gotten to, and this video is already long enough. But I just want us to maybe think of these two things. This is nowhere near being my final thoughts. I'm still working through this. I'm still working through my own images and my own thoughts on him. So I would love to hear what other people are saying, and I would like it to be more of a community discussion. I would like it to be more about Africans trying to understand whether you are on both sides. But please don't come at me with he stopped war and like the surface level arguments. I don't know if I'm going to be able to have patience for that. I have very little patience for I have very little patience for surface level arguments. My whole point here is to try and delve deeper into more than the Jesus Christ figure and more than the sellout, the F Mandela crowd, because I think there's so much more between those two symbols that can be used and that can actually help us on more than a we are South Africa Rainbow Nation reconciliation level. I think we can learn a lot about activism. I think we can learn a lot about principled activism. I think we can learn a lot about being part of an organization. For many of us, we are building from the bottom and trying to figure out how to actually be effective without structures that necessarily seem to end up working against us. And I think the likes of the Mandela generation have given us some of those frameworks and have given us things that we can build on. But I also think there is a lot that we need to learn from them in order to not make the same mistakes. So thanks for watching and listening. I hope that you've at least gotten something to think about through this video, if anything. And whatever you've done during this Mandela Day, I don't know if I'm for or against it at this point, I'm not going to lie. But if you did anything, I hope that you had fun doing it. And if you choose not to embrace it in the same way I choose not to, I have absolutely no problem with that as well. Thanks so much, guys. Keep well until the next one. Bye.